Good afternoon, everyone. Wherever you are in the world, I hope you and your loved ones are healthy and safe. My name is Randy Bell, and I'm the director of the Global Energy Center at the Atlantic Council. Thank you so much for joining us today for our panel on energy and environment in the next administration. This event is part of the Atlantic Council's Elections 2020 series, which explores key questions about America's role in the world in the lead up to the November elections. Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. First, let me thank Samsung, who has generously donated their very cool studio space for the duration of the Elections 2020 series. This is where I am right now. If you're on Twitter, you can follow us at AC Global Energy and tweet us using the hashtag AC Energy and AC Elections 2020. If you're interested in asking questions during the Q&A session, please submit them using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and our fantastic panelists will do their best to answer them. Now, in coordination with this panel today, we're launching an issue brief titled, "What's at Stake for Energy in the 2020 Election?" This report is authored by David Goldwyn, the moderator of today's session, and Andrea Claybaugh. It considers consequences for the energy sector under a Trump re-election or a Biden election. David will give a brief outline of the paper, which you can now find on our website, before we get started with the conversation. And to have that conversation today, we really have a remarkable bipartisan group of panelists with a depth of knowledge and experience in energy, environment, and climate policy. So I'll make brief introductions and we'll go to David. So first, we have the Honorable Carlos Curbelo, former US Representative for Florida's 26th Congressional District. We have Dr. Jonathan Pershing, former Special Envoy for Climate Change at the State Department. The Honorable Liz Sherwood Randall, former Deputy Secretary of Energy. And last but not least, the Honorable Christine Todd Whitman, former Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency and former Governor of New Jersey. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to today's moderator and one of the co-authors of the report, David Goldwyn, who's the chairman of the Atlantic Council's Energy Advisory Group and the former Special Envoy and Coordinator for International Energy Affairs at the State Department, and also former Assistant Secretary of Energy for International Affairs. David, the Zoom room is yours.
Great, thank you, Randy, and thanks to all of my panelists, and thanks to all of you for watching us today. Boy, what a difference 7 months make. In January of 2020, when we released the first version of this report, What's at Stake for Energy in the election, we were in Abu Dhabi at the Global Energy Summit. Carlos and I were on a stage together, and we were looking at what a second Trump administration would look like compared to what then a theoretical field of Democratic candidates. And while we were pretty certain what a Trump 2.0 administration would look like, the Democratic field was more ambitious than any other Democratic field had been, but there was a wide variety of views. Now, fast forward 7 months later, people had not heard of COVID before, but now we're dealing with a global pandemic. GDP will drop almost 8% this year, unemployment at 11%, and really a ravaging of the energy sector as well. As you'd expect in a world where people are working from home, not taking vacations, not driving, demand has crashed and supply along with it. So in the energy world, we're looking at almost 800,000 barrels a day decline in production of oil, a drop in LNG exports from 8.1 to 3.2 billion cubic feet a day, 240 bankruptcies, and huge job losses across the sector, including in the renewable energy sector. So the realities have been vast, but America's also been dealing with a reckoning on race. You know, the outcry following the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others has opened people's eyes to the intersection between race and environmental justice. So the questions of the disproportionate impact of COVID on communities of color, the disproportionate siting of infrastructure near communities of color, and the health impacts have brought environmental justice to the forefront as well. So we are looking at today, Americans are looking at today, two very stark choices between President Trump's in a second term and now Joe Biden as the Democratic nominee. For President Trump, he has promised more energy dominance, and this means opening of more federal lands, more deregulation, as we have seen with the elimination of rules on methane, the elimination of calculation of methane on federal lands, changes to waters of the United States, and new NEPA rules which don't assess indirect or cumulative impacts of environmental projects. So from our assessment, we don't see any reason to believe why there would be a much difference in a second Trump administration than the first. Deregulation will continue, the pushing and opening of more federal lands for exploration would continue. And while there has been a significant increase in concern about climate change among young Republicans, and there has been support for 1 trillion trees and carbon sequestration and innovation in technology, in the space of impact on climate, we see not much change. With Joe Biden as the presumptive nominee, we now see a historically ambitious green ambitions, I guess, on the Democratic side. And Vice President Biden has managed to unite the progressive wing led by Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders with the so-called moderate wing that he and others lead. And his ambitions are now clear also. He's talking about net zero emissions by 2050, zero emissions from the power sector by 2035 by application of the clean energy standard and energy efficient standards, talking about $1 trillion in green energy infrastructure, which will be made in America, American solar panels, American solar turbines. He's embraced carbon border adjustment and 1 million new jobs in the auto industry. And environmental justice in the assessment of projects is now center in his policy and that of Vice President nominee Kamala Harris as well. We think in our assessment that both these candidates are likely to face some significant uncertainties and headwinds, and therefore we're facing volatility ahead. The first question is whether there is a sweep of one party or we continue to have divided government. And we'll talk about that today, how much either side can prosecute its ambitions in that circumstance. The second is the continuation of the pandemic and its economic impact. We have not bent the curve. Kids are not going back to school this fall, and so that impact will continue, and that may have an effect on how much we can spend and how much demand there is for energy. And then there's the question of the social focus, which is how much does the administration of the day matter when BlackRock and others are starting to score companies on their ESG metrics, when states are having their own clean energy mandates, when pipelines are being waylaid or withdrawn because of disputes at the local area, and when the rush to permit things quickly has resulted in a variety of court cases which insist on the implementation of the National Environmental Protection Act. So a fair amount of uncertainty ahead, and that should make for a very interesting conversation today. And I want to jump right in and ask Governor Whitman whether we've got this right. You know, in terms of the baseline for a second Trump administration, do you expect more of the same? Where do you see there are differences, and where is there space for common cause and bipartisan agreement?
Well, I think you've got it absolutely right. And first, I want to thank the Atlantic Council for doing this and to highlight the fact that we need to be talking seriously about our energy needs, infrastructure, the grid. All of these things are part of what's going to face us in the future, trying to provide the kind of energy that we all want as 24/7 people. But I don't see any reason to assume that there'll be a change in the Trump administration. He will feel no constraints if he gets a second term, and he will move even faster to deregulate. The problem is that he's trading off the long-term health of the country, humans and the environment, for a short-term supposed gain. I mean, for instance, rolling back some of the environmental regulations on clean water for the coal mining companies is not going to bring coal back. Coal isn't dying because of environmental regulations. It's dying because of fracking and other ways of extracting energy at a much less cost. But what it is doing is endangering the lives of those people who live in the hollers of West Virginia and Kentucky, who are downstream from where these tailings will be dumped and who will find their water supplies being contaminated with lead and with arsenic and mercury, which is what you find in them. So it's going to continue. He's going to continue to push for things, but the reality that you point out is going to happen too. A lot of the companies are saying, hey, it's not worth it. And Prudhoe Bay, opening up Prudhoe Bay, there have been how many different times companies have gone up there to look at it and have just walked away and said, it's not worth it. So much as he's going to push for things, I'm not sure it's all going to happen. And when you have things like the Climate Leadership Council, which includes some of the major energy companies in the United States, ExxonMobil, BP, Royal Dutch Shell, all saying we need a carbon tax, and they're moving in that direction because the rest of the world takes climate change seriously. And so they're going to continue to move with or without the president, as will the states, as you point out in the study.
Great, thank you. Congressman Corbella, same question. And also, I have to ask you, because you've spent so much time on carbon tax, whether you think there's any prospect in either party or in any scenario for elevating a carbon tax proposal.
Hello, David. Thank you. Thanks to the Atlantic Council for this opportunity. Look, for those who support or looking forward to the transition to a clean energy economy, a second Trump administration would obviously be bad news. The president is not going to become an ally of accelerating that transition. At least he's given no indication that he's willing to do so. The good news is that regardless of what happens with the presidential election this November, there's a clear trend in Congress where obviously Democrats have reached not a point of consensus, because there are a lot of different ideas, but certainly an agreement that we have to advance towards a clean energy economy. And Republicans are finally starting to catch up, to gain some ground in this space. The Congress I left in January of 2019 looks a lot different than the Congress that we're watching today. Republican leaders would never even talk about this issue in the past. Today you have Kevin McCarthy, the House Republican leader, saying that Republicans need to listen to younger voters and have to develop their agenda to address climate change. Republicans met as a conference behind closed doors for the first time ever, specifically to discuss climate change. That's an extraordinary change. In the United States Senate, you have 7 Republican senators led by Mike Braun of Indiana, who have joined 7 Democratic senators to form the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus in that body. While I was in Congress, we tried for years to get the Senate to form a caucus that would be a companion to the House caucus, and it was difficult to gain traction. That has now happened, and Republicans, many of who opposed, for example, tax credits for carbon capture, are now championing it as one of their ideas. So there's a clear, irreversible trend in Congress that's fundamental if we're ever going to get national comprehensive energy policy. And that brings us, of course, to carbon pricing. I remind people, for those who support the idea of carbon pricing, we don't need Republicans to embrace or to be enthusiastic about the idea. We just need them to accept it as part of a broader compromise. And as more and more Republicans start convening around the idea of massive public and private investment in research and development to promote and advance new technologies that can help us reduce carbon emissions, capture carbon emissions, sequester carbon dioxide, the demand for revenue is going to continue to grow, and not just for those kinds of projects, but also for tax reform, for extending the individual tax cuts that were passed in 2017. There's a cliff coming up here in a few years. This is a government that's going to need revenue, and as that demand for revenue increases, the possibility of a price on carbon becomes greater. Of course, if Democrats end up taking control of the United States Senate, you could see carbon pricing through reconciliation. Not that it will be easy. There are senators like Joe Manchin on the left who can't be counted on automatically to support that kind of policy, but certainly the probabilities that that could even be considered, make it to the Senate floor, would increase drastically.
Great, thank you. Let me turn next to Secretary Sherwood-Randall. You've been in government, and so you've seen what it's like to operate in divided government. So what's the outlook for the ability of a Vice President Biden, President Biden, to be able to get his headline agenda items if you're facing divided government?
Thank you, David. And I join in with my colleagues in thanking the Atlantic Council for hosting this important dialogue. And it's great to follow Congressman Corbella, because I think what he has said is so important for all of us to recognize, whether we are discussing how to address a pandemic or to deal with climate change, these phenomena know no borders, know no parties. Our people are experiencing the effects of a pandemic and the effects of climate change, whether they're in red states or blue states, whatever party affiliation they may have had. And so we are all going to have to come together to deal with these challenges. And in my experience of working with and for Vice President Biden over many decades, I can say that he is a candidate and ultimately I hope will be the president who will have that capacity to bring our country together. His legislative experience and his leadership experience at the White House demonstrates his pragmatism, his desire to build common ground with those who do not share his political views, and to bring this country together around the most exigent issues that we face. And there I would note the way in which he deals with the most difficult challenges is not to push people away, but actually to try to rally them around an agenda that will build that coalition necessary to success. And most exemplary of that right now is the Build Back Better plan for climate and clean energy, which was put out last month as an improvement upon the first version. And importantly, that happened because of the COVID-19 crisis and the impact on jobs and growth in our economy, and the fact that it has had disproportionate impact on communities of color. And so there we see, for example, in the oil sector, huge implications for Latino workers who've been thrown out of jobs, disproportionate to other groups. This plan and his focus on the jobs dimension of the climate agenda will be crucial to building that kind of bipolar that will be necessary to achieving our shared climate goals in the next administration.
Great, thank you. Dr. Pershing, let me turn to you next. You've been a climate negotiator, but also a savvy political observer as well. What role does natural gas play in the energy transition, both here in the United States and also internationally? Here at home, while he's been pushed, Vice President Biden has not endorsed a fracking ban, not talked about banning exports. So there's clearly a role there, and there's concerns in Pennsylvania and Colorado, New Mexico. How do you balance these, the transition to decarbonization and the natural gas issues as well?
So like others, I want to thank you, David, and the Atlantic Council for holding this conversation. And I also want to make a note that I'm not part of the Biden campaign discussion, so I can't at all speak for those who are in that conversation. You take it from a slightly different perspective about where this might be going. I want to start off with, I think, where Dr. Sherwood Randall framed it. We're in the middle of trying to solve what I think of as one of the most fundamental crises facing the global community. By 2050, we more or less have to get to essentially zero net emissions. It doesn't mean that the emissions have to go to zero. It means that we have to balance them with a combination of technologies, land use conversations that both allow the emissions that might go up to be absorbed or to reduce those that we cannot absorb. That zero is a pretty tough number to get to. Getting to zero doesn't mean you don't have any gas, but it means if you do have any gas, you're going to need an awful lot of carbon capture. It means that if you do have it, you're going to have to convert it into something else that doesn't have ancillary emissions that are attached. So that kind of dynamic plays out not in terms of an instantaneous change. No one sees that happening. We're not looking to have a disruptive community process, either in the United States or globally. But what we are looking for is a set of scenarios and technologies that, as they unfold, will lead to that net zero outcome. So what does that mean for the fossil fuels broadly? Coal's kind of tough. Very hard to see the same kind of coal use that we've had in the past anywhere in the world. And in fact, what we are seeing is that increasingly it's not economic. Many coal plants, certainly in the United States, but increasingly globally, are operating at a loss. Analyses have suggested that many of those coal facilities, in fact, are more expensive to run even if they've had fully amortized upfront capital investment, are more expensive to run than building a new zero-emitting source of electricity. So coal, not a very promising long-term scenario. Gas is still competitive in a number of places against our current capacity to provide baseload guaranteed power. My sense is that's going to be there for some period of time. We're going to be producing it. It'll manage itself globally. It'll be part of a conversation in which the US as a gas producer will be a party. But it has to be seen in the context of how you get to zero, because this climate threat is deep and real and urgent. And I think we're already starting to see people looking at alternatives. They're looking at how they can manage to get the baseload consistently available in the future and make that work. And at the same time, to think about, well, what do those communities do? These are not just the gas communities, but the oil communities, and in fact, the coal communities. This transition question is going to be a matter of global import. It'll be a matter for the economic side and the human side. How do people live? What kind of jobs do they have? What will their communities do without the tax revenues that come from these activities? That's going to be a model that either president, either Congress, using Congressman Corbello's framing, if Congress goes down the road, which it will do because of the urgency of this question, will have to grapple with. And so to me, gas is one of the questions. I see it as a transition, but it's a transition that's going to have to move ultimately to how it frames itself in a net zero world.
David, may I make a comment on what Jonathan has said?
Please.
I think it's so important to acknowledge what he has just argued, and to add that we still have work to do on lowering our own methane emissions from the natural gas sector. And unfortunately, following what Governor Whitman has said earlier about the repeal of many regulations that this administration inherited, just last week, the Trump administration finalized the repeal of the methane regulation, the rules that governed the reduction in methane emissions from the natural gas sector. Industry opposed that decision. Industry is moving out with plans because it sees the future and wants to make that transition and use natural gas as the bridge fuel both at home and around the world. So these are difficult issues. It's not pure to say that we need to get on that bridge and walk across it to the energy future, because there are elements of natural gas that continue to emit, and methane is a very significant challenge for us. But we have the possibility of making progress, and we need to come together around that and work together with the private sector to achieve it.
Terrific. Let's turn now to the question of climate more specifically, and I want to ask. I want to actually come back to Jonathan Pershing and ask him, in a Democratic administration, if President Biden wants to reassert leadership on climate leadership, can the United States still do it, or have we lost our credibility? And then I want to turn to our Republican colleagues on what a Republican policy on climate might look like. But Jonathan, you first.
So thanks very much, David. I think the answer is yes. The United States absolutely can do it. But I don't think it's a straightforward task. This will be not the first time, not the second time, but the third time that we've gone for a process, put ourselves forward as a leader of the global community, and then walked it back. We did it the first time when we signed on to the Climate Convention. That was back in 1992. And following the Climate Convention, we then dithered and didn't really go very far forward and were unable to meet the commitments and the goals. We did it the second time, in which we essentially led the development of the Kyoto Protocol. It was a US-led process. It happened under Japanese meeting auspices, but it was a US dynamic, really pushed, and using many of the ideas that had fundamental bipartisan agreement, a market-structured mechanism for capping trade. We walked away from that. We then led the process starting in Copenhagen and concluding in Paris for a third agreement, one that took explicit account of the framing, again, bipartisan in nature, that demanded that all countries participate. I was one of the fortunate people involved in that negotiation. It was an uphill slog, but we got global agreement. We are joined by no other countries in our withdrawal from that process. So once again, we're going to have to come back and say, what is it next that we do? Why would others look to the United States and say, here is the exemplar of how we want the world to move? Whenever we move the way they say, they back down. I think this time it's going to have to follow a different course. It's going to have to follow a course in which the domestic agenda will lead, and there will be a set of aggressive and clear domestic outcomes, framing a deep reduction plan. That will then be followed. And that's going to have to incorporate a number of pieces that I think the US could deliver on. It's going to have to talk about how jobs work. It's going to have to talk about how the economy continues to grow even when emissions are cut sharply. It's going to have to talk about finance and how markets work, because those are things that people look around the world to the US to think about and deliver on. And it's going to have to deliver leadership. There's going to have to be a point which can rally the Europeans, rally the Indians, talk aggressively with the Chinese, think about how we play with Africa. What is the model for Latin America? We're going to have to represent that in a comprehensive fashion that addresses the needs and concerns and builds on the strength of a domestic agenda that the US has to run.
Really helpful. Governor Whitman, I want to turn to you and the Congressman next and ask you, what is the Republican, not the President Trump's, but what's a Republican position on climate? What can Republicans be for? I've heard, both of you talk about what it should be and heard the Congressman talk about growing support. But are there a list of things from science to the Paris Agreement that you think can constitute a Republican position on climate change?
Well, first, let me say that I think Jonathan hit it absolutely right. We're going to have to show leadership domestically before people are going to believe us internationally. I can remember from my first G8 meeting of the environmental ministers, when I went over and said, no, we're not going to ratify Kyoto, but we will put a cap on carbon, only to come back and find out that the administration had changed that position. And it made it a little difficult to work with my colleagues from then on. I mean, they were very cordial and everything, but they just, what can you believe when I'd spent a lot of time saying that this is what we're going to do, because I'd cleared it with the White House only to have it change. So we're going to have to start domestically. But there is a caucus in the Congress, not just what the Congressman mentioned of a bipartisan caucus. There also is a Republican group, just Republicans talking about climate change and how to move forward. And again, if you look at a carbon tax the way the Baker-Schultz carbon tax is proposed, it would return that money to the taxpayer, which becomes more palatable for Republicans, although given COVID and what it's done to the economy overall, that may now be a pipe dream. It may have to go into the federal coffers, but until people see that it could be used in an insensible way and address some of the problems that we're facing today, I think they're going to be reluctant of sending any more money to the federal government. But Republicans are going to have to get together, have to start having these conversations and not hide from it. That's another part of the problem that we have, is we've been reluctant to embrace it. And no matter what happens, if Trump wins a second term, some people are going to have to stand up to him. And again, as Congressman Cabello can testify, that's not all that easy to do. But it's something that has to happen. But I agree that if we don't start it here first and show some commitment, some real commitment to making changes that are going to affect the world, the rest of the world isn't going to pay attention to us when we come back and say, here's how we think it ought to go.
Congressman Curbelo, is there a short list of things that you think Republicans should come out for? Does that on methane, on eliminating flaring, on Paris? What's your wish list of what you think, even under a second Trump term, congressional Republicans ought to come out vocally to support?
Well, David, again, there's some good news on this front. There's already an emerging Republican congressional agenda on climate. That includes embracing carbon capture tax credits, 45Q. It's incredible. In 2018, I remember being in negotiations and discussions and having Speaker Ryan and Chairman Kevin Brady of the House Ways and Means Committee aggressively opposing any expansion of 45Q. Right now, Republicans are embracing that and claiming that policy for themselves. Reforestation has emerged as an area of consensus for Republicans. The idea of making public investments in research and development. Congressman Tom Reed of New York, House Ways and Means Committee member, for some time now has been advocating for a technology neutral tax credit, one that will allow markets to choose which is the most efficient technology for reducing carbon capture emissions. Direct air capture is something that is getting on the radar of Republicans. Of course, this is all good and these developments are positive. Is it enough? Probably not. This agenda has to grow more and more ambitious. And that's why I think that ultimately Republicans will warm up to the idea of pricing carbon, specifically because of one element of that policy, which is the border adjustment tax. I think that probably the strongest conservative argument against entering into treaties or agreements with other countries is that a lot of times the other countries cheat or don't keep their commitments. We certainly can cite countless examples of that throughout history. As the Republican Party continues becoming comfortable with the idea of confronting China, and even for those of us who have many disagreements with President Trump, we recognize that he has made some important contributions on that front, really highlighting the risks associated with our China policy. As Republicans become more comfortable in that role, this border adjustment component becomes attractive because it doesn't require us to trust any country to follow us on clean energy policy. It really almost compels, especially leading economies, to join us. That is, if they want to continue selling their products in our market. So I think it's going to take some time, but I think we can get a critical mass of Republicans supporting carbon pricing because of this one element of the policy, the border adjustment tax, and as Governor Chris Todd Whitman said, also the fact that our government is just going to need revenue, and Republicans, at least in theory, are the party of fiscal conservatism. Although I discovered while I was in Congress that the minority party is always the party of fiscal conservatism. Doesn't matter if it's Republicans or Democrats.
I'm not sure either party is for fiscal conservatism in this next term, but we'll see. Dr. Sherwood-Riddle, let me come to you next and really ask you two questions. You may have thoughts on the international side, but in addition, as a former senior official, how do you get this national plan in place by the September conference of the parties next year if you win? And in addition, how do you bring science back to the agencies? Is there a toolkit that at least you would go to try and reinstitute the use of science, and also to produce the nationally determined commitment by September of 2021?
Thank you, David. So first of all, I would just say, gathering together what we've heard from my colleagues, what will be most important internationally is for us to lead with humility and technology. And so those two qualities are going to be essential to our return to global leadership on climate. The first thing we need to do is the work that will be required to present that much more ambitious statement that we should present at COP26. How do you get that done, you've asked? Well, the first thing I would do is announce on day one that we intend to return to Paris, and that work can get underway sooner if Vice President Biden is elected. There's a transition period when work can get underway. There is an extremely deep bench of competent people, a number of whom have collaborated on the work of the Atlantic Council and other think tanks and research institutions, universities, national laboratories, and there's an enormous amount of analysis that needs to be brought together to prepare that ambitious plan. But we must approach that event with humility, and in so doing, by presenting a very ambitious plan, we demonstrate that we are determined now to re-enter, re-engage, and ultimately earn the confidence of allies and partners and rivals to lead. This will entail two things, in my view. One will be the imperative of initiating the kind of international scientific research, collaborative endeavors that we were very focused on advancing in the prior administration. We don't have all the answers, and climate science is global, and there are capabilities that we need to connect to and leverage all around the world to advance the research, development, and deployment of the technologies that will meet the challenge, as you noted, of the 2050 goal of net zero in our economy and progression in other economies. And there's so much work to be done there on electric grid modernization, on storage and batteries, on efficient buildings, on hydrogen, renewable and clean hydrogen, on industrial processes, heat, for example. So many areas of technology research that need to be advanced, and we should be doing it with others. Second, importantly, the current administration abandoned all collaborative work with other countries on helping them meet their climate goals. We provide enormous technical competence to other countries that are struggling to figure out how to implement their own NDCs, how to pursue the ambitious goals that they set for themselves, sometimes with our assistance. We need to work with other countries to help them to revise their plans based on the 4 years that have lapsed since we last engaged, and then help them to develop implementation plans, which are based on technologies that we may be able to bring to bear, and all of the other experience that we can offer in assisting them in moving forward. Because as I noted earlier, we're all in this together, and if we don't help other countries achieve their climate goals, we are not going to succeed in meeting the needs of the planet in the next decade.
Really helpful. A number of questions from the audience on China. China was supposed to be a major source of US energy exports, but with the trade wars, that's not working out so well. China was a major partner on climate in the Obama administration, but now they are a major challenge in terms of dominating global supply chains for battery materials and renewable energy technology, and their concerns about intellectual property, privacy, piracy as well. So, how do you deal with China? You know, friend or foe, partner or not, going forward? And how do you, for either administration, how do you have a somewhat nationalistic American jobs first energy industry of whatever stripe and deal with Chinese competition? I'll leave this open. Who wants to volunteer first on this one? Jonathan, I'll tag you.
So I think it's one of the critical questions, David, that has to be answered. And I think we'll probably all have views on it, as will either administration. But one of the things that I think we cannot afford is for a process in which we assume that China is the enemy on climate. We don't have the luxury. Chinese emissions are about 30% of the global total. US emissions are only 15 or less than 15, half of the Chinese. If we don't have China, we do not solve the problem. It doesn't mean that we walk forward and assume that China is our friend on all fronts. It won't be. It isn't. But it does mean that we have to find scenarios in which we can work constructively with them. It doesn't mean there won't be competition. There will be. And if the United States leans into this competition, we will do very well. If we don't, we'll have our lunch eat, because they're working on this. The investment that they're making in renewables, in battery technology, in advanced vehicles should not be underestimated. It's enormous, and they intend to own that market unless we compete. But if we compete, if we engage, then we actually have allies. We have allies around the world, including in China, who are looking to advance this agenda. One of the things that strikes me that we have to think about is how to build those alliances. So the alliances are not just in the formal bilateral conversation with the Chinese, they're in the other conversations with Europe, which is also worried about China and how it moves forward, with India, with our colleagues in Latin America and Africa, who are seeing massive Chinese investment, and when they turn to the United States, there's no one home. That doesn't serve us well. But if we lean in, we actually have market opportunities. We have ways to take American jobs and American workers' productive results and make them available globally. And we have our joint ventures, and we have our capacity for investment that will make the world a better place and return the US to what I think of as a legitimate and real place as a leader. But we can't go it alone. This is going to require a concerted collective effort. And China is mounting such an effort. China's investing in these places. We have to have an alternative model to present to the world that speaks to a US set of values, a US vision. And from that position, we can then negotiate with China. And we can be successful. We have historically been, we can be again, but only if we take this collective vision as opposed to an individual action, which I think is doomed to fail.
Anything else? Liz, please.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Jonathan. That was an impassioned statement, and I agree with it 100%. I'd add that we haven't touched yet on the security dimension of the climate challenge, which is multidimensional. But in this domain, for example, when you're talking about assisting other countries and countering the very deliberate effort of the Chinese to sell their technologies around the world to advance lower carbon goals, let's look at the nuclear industry. The Chinese have successfully sold into many countries to help them build nuclear power plants. Now, nuclear power is controversial among some. I do see it as an important element of clean energy, especially in a number of developing countries. We are not able to compete right now. Our industry is not able to compete. If the United States is not able to compete in selling nuclear power around the world, the standards that we have upheld on preventing proliferation will collapse. And those are crucial to another vital effort, as vital as the climate effort, which is to prevent the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. So we have reason, both for our climate goals and for our national security goals, to support our industries in bringing nuclear power solutions to countries around the world. And that means we need to come up with an American financing plan to do it. We need to support our industry to be in the game, because the Chinese and also the Russians, who also are very competitive and come in at under market prices, are doing just that. And we're going to need to meet the need on both of these fronts by bringing our industries to the table with competitive proposals for countries that want to build new nuclear.
Can I join in and just second that? Because there's so much investment that we can make on small modular reactors. These are the wave of the future, particularly for the sub-Sahara countries and some of those that are being the most adversely affected by climate change, who need to find power sources. And this is something where we can excel. There are also all the different ways now of producing nuclear power. Fusion is coming. It's always been coming, 25 years now. I think it's down to maybe 10 years from now. Fusion will be a source upon which we can rely. They'll figure out how to sustain that power. But also you have, for instance, in Canada, they're deploying molten salt reactors. That's a company that wants to do business here in the United States, is working through the Department of Energy, but we can do that. We can do those things. And if we were to make the kind of investment that's being called for, I think we could lead the world without question, and it would have a positive impact as a bridge until we can get to the point where the renewables are base power and not just peak shaving.
Thank you, Governor. Congressman Curbelo, I don't know if you wanted to come in on China.
I'll just caution everyone. Obviously, there are strong policy arguments for constructively engaging the Chinese. But like with anything in our space, we have to factor in both policy and politics. And there has been a drastic shift in the United States when it comes to China. The skepticism levels are very high amongst the public, and the political palatability of putting out a message that we have to trust the Chinese or even work collaboratively with them, although academically, again, from a policy perspective, makes absolute sense. I think that being soft on China is going to be a major political liability for the next decade in American politics, no matter if you're Republican or Democrat. So this is going to be a very complicated policy area. And again, that's why I keep going back to the border adjustment component of carbon pricing, because it doesn't require any trust. It sets rules, it sets standards, similar to what we were trying to achieve with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, both Republicans in Congress and the Obama administration, because we knew how powerful that would be and how that would in many ways compel the Chinese to act responsibly to promote a global order where everyone can succeed. We're going to have similar challenges in this space in the coming years.
Great. Actually, I want to ask Dr. Sherwood-Randall a follow-up on the carbon border adjustment policy. I mean, the Europeans have come out. This is a question from our reporter in our audience. The Europeans have come out with a pretty aggressive carbon levy, and I guess the one question is: would a Biden administration welcome that levy as part of a system of rules? But how is the U.S. industry going to react to if their exports are basically carbon weighted by their emissions content?
We have a lot of work to do to rebuild a collaborative relationship with our European allies, who are our largest trading partner and who have been hit with tariffs that they literally don't understand, and sanctions that are suggestive of their being adversaries rather than the allies that they have been for. So we will need to work out with the Europeans a plan that works for our businesses just as theirs. That's very important. I think the matter of principle here is that we do want to be sure that high emitters cannot come in and undercut our industries, that we need to support our manufacturing sector, and that is an absolutely essential dimension of the Biden plan, the Build Back Better plan. So a person who has great experience working closely with allies to strengthen our global position, to enable us to leverage our power successfully, that is Joe Biden. He understands what it means to forge and maintain alliances, and that will be a very important element of our climate and clean energy agenda going forward.
Great. Let me ask all of you about this question of environmental justice. It's been there a long time. It is manifesting itself and centered now in a way that it never has been before. It has a domestic dimension in how and where we site infrastructure and how we deal with emissions. And it has an international dimension as well in terms of the impact of climate change on countries around the world. How do you center that issue and take that on? And how will maybe Jonathan, I'll start with you. How is climate diplomacy going to be different this time because of that issue than it was before?
So thanks, David. I think it's going to play out in a couple of different ways. On the domestic front, I think it will end up playing out very much in terms of where we site, where we build, and what communities we seek to bring to the table that have historically been left out. I use as an example a recent bill that was passed in California around trucks. Really interesting example. It turns out that a very substantial share, the better part of 50% of all freight flowing from Asia into the United States comes to the port of Los Angeles, Long Beach. And it comes to the Inland Empire where it's stored in warehouses. And then it's distributed around the country. Well, it turns out that the people who live near that freight route have enormously higher numbers of asthma cases. They've got much higher pollution associated with the diesel fumes. They're living near those ports in which those ships come in with substantial emissions. California passed, with the help of those constituents, an aggressive bill about trucks, moving us down the road to a less polluting, more electrification opportunity, more job opportunity while retaining the level of economic growth and development. And it was passed because those communities leaned in and said, you know what, this is good for us. This outcome will grow our economy and improve our kids' health and welfare. That's consistent. If you think about how you do that across the country, you have the same kinds of things happening in the Texas Gulf. You have the same kinds of things happening in New Jersey, and the governor can speak to them. You have the same kinds of dynamics playing out in New York and in Minnesota and in Colorado, not just in California. On the international side, the exact same thing is playing out. If we look at who bears the brunt of the climate change damages, it's not the wealthy among us. We'll be able to find comfortable places that are out of the flood zone, that are high enough up to be cool, or to air condition ourselves comfortably. But if we look at the most recent data in India, and they're projecting numbers that have temperatures in excess of 110 degrees, and people have no air conditioning, that's who bears the brunt. We have to understand that. We have to work with the adaptation strategies and responses that are global, and the US has to stand up for that. And if we do that domestically, I think we have winners. And if we do it internationally, we have winners. And we build alliances. We do them at home and we do them overseas. And if we do that, the leadership that we were talking about just a moment ago, I think is ours. Because we can deliver, and we have shown historically that we can deliver. When we put the pieces together, it's not just the wealthy who succeed, all of us move forward. And that's a very compelling narrative, but it's one we really have to center.
We're coming almost to the end of our time. I want to give Congressman Curbelo or Governor Whitman a chance to talk about sort of a Republican view on this environmental justice question.
Well, just briefly, Governor, I'm happy to see
No, go ahead, Congressman.
I'll be brief so you can jump in right after. I think we should look at trade policy, and there are a lot of lessons to be learned there. How did we fail on trade policy? And a lot of times we were insensitive. A lot of times we were very mathematically driven about how we address trade policy. And eventually, a lot of Americans reacted negatively and punished politicians, both Republicans and Democrats. And now have to re-educate the American public and show why open trade, free trade in many instances makes sense. I think on advancing, accelerating the transition to a clean energy economy, we have to make sure not to make the same mistakes. And there are leaders in Congress who are very sensitive to this. Senator Whitehouse of Rhode Island in particular often talks about how retired coal workers should be received and celebrated as national heroes. And I think that's probably a smart way of approaching this issue of environmental justice, make sure we don't repeat some of the mistakes of the past.
Okay, thank you.
I was just going to add that I think we've turned a corner. I don't think you are going to, right now you have the movements that we've on racial disparity and on the injustice we've seen. That's not going to go away. And those communities have found their voice, and they are going to refuse to be ignored any longer. And so I really think we have reached a point where we're going to see a focused agenda on environmental justice and make sure we don't commit the same mistakes as the congressman said, as we have in the past. And just because they may not be the wealthy communities that donate to everybody who's making those policy decisions, we can't just dump on them any longer, which is what we've been doing.
That's right. And I think certainly on the Democratic side, there's talk about adding an environmental justice screen formally to permitting decisions. And on the market side, we've already seen that there are projects that have been withdrawn because of local opposition, whether that's environmental or whether that's on justice. Northeast Supply, Constitution, Atlantic Coast Pipeline, most of those are environmental, but compressor stations in Rockingham, Virginia as well. A number of questions from the audience come back to natural gas, and Dr. Sherwood-Randall, I want to come back to you on this, and it's the question about whether the Biden plan to stop leasing of federal lands or to add more regulation on emissions hurts the natural gas industry, and whether that hurts jobs or the industries which depend on natural gas. I guess what reassurance can you give to those who are connected to that industry that the Biden administration is not going to hurt their jobs?
Thanks, David. Actually, I was going to pick up on prior comments and emphasize the importance of paying attention to the workforce in oil and gas communities. And this is relevant to what I noted earlier about the consequences of COVID and its impact on the economy. It will be relevant to the transition that we undertake toward a cleaner energy economy and the ambitious goals that Vice President Biden has set for his administration. And they're learning the lesson from what has been done right and not done right in the past, and also understanding the differences between coal country and oil and gas country. We will need to have a very aggressive plan designed to assist the communities that will be most impacted by the market forces that are in play, and also the changes that will be implemented for policy reasons to address our energy and climate needs. And this involves focus on regions. Regions are quite different across the country. Texas is different from Pennsylvania, for example, goes without saying. And so this will need to be an integrated part of our approach. And one of the important dimensions of this challenge we haven't really had an opportunity to talk about is the need to rapidly develop the technologies for carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And there may well be that there is a big opportunity for the workforce in oil and gas country to shift to working in very important new opportunities if we can get that technology broadly deployed to address the challenges that we face. So that's for another conversation to talk about new technologies and how we can most rapidly bring them to market and give opportunities to American workers, especially in displaced communities, and workers around the world who will equally need to be brought along in order to support the transition their countries need to make. Thank you.
We've got just a minute or two left, and before I turn it back to Randy, I wanted to come back to Governor Whitman. I've seen that you have publicly called for a reset at EPA. You've signed a letter with other EPA administrators. I wonder if you'd just give us a snapshot of what you think needs to be done.
Well, first of all, and it's something that was discussed a little bit at the beginning, we have to reassert the importance of science, pure science. Scientists have to be told that they matter. Right now, they're being told by this administration that they don't matter, that we don't care about science, that politics trumps everything, policy is secondary. And scientists are getting frustrated. The agency, they have lost some 700 to 900 by now. Scientists, people have left the agency out of frustration. Many of those are scientists, and where they're being replaced, they're unfortunately, with the scientists particularly, being replaced with representatives from industry, scientists who were with industries being regulated by the agency. Now, industry has a right to be heard on any regulation that may be being proposed on that particular industry because they know it better than anybody else, but they should not determine the science behind the decision. That has to be based on pure science. So that has to happen. You have to take away the restrictions that have been put on the scientists about their ability to collaborate with others, about an ability to attend conferences, particularly if, heaven forbid, climate change is mentioned. They're not allowed to do that now. They're not allowed to take it into consideration as they look at the impact of some of these regulations. So it really is going to be incumbent on a new administration to put in somebody in the agency who believes in its mission. And the mission is very simple: protect human health and the environment. There are different ways of doing that, but that's the mission. And we've got to have somebody who's really committed to doing that and shows some respect for the people who are there, the career people, and particularly the scientists.
Great. Thank you very much. And let me, before I turn it back to Randy, just thank you to all the panelists. We've covered a lot of ground here today. We've outlined the very stark choices that Americans face when they go to their voting booths or send their mail-in ballots in this November. But we've also outlined a number of areas for potential common cause, and that's encouraging. Randy, let me turn it back to you to wrap up.
Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Thank you, David. Thank you to our really fantastic panelists for joining us. That was a remarkable conversation. You can share this conversation later through the Atlantic Council YouTube page, Facebook or Twitter. Please do share it with your colleagues. I'd also like to thank the team who put this event together, including Emily Burlinghouse, David Yellen, Katie Wimsett, Rachel Chang, Lauren Holland, Bridget Corna, Jackson Styron, Roger Morales, and Bain Ennis. I hope you'll join us for other upcoming events in the Elections 2020 series. For more information and to register, go to atlanticcouncil.org/elections2020. Additionally, this week, the Global Energy Center is hosting Caroline Cochran, co-founder and chief operating officer of Oklo, company developing a community-scale micronuclear reactor, something folks on the panel talked about a little bit, Friday at 2 p.m. So please look at the Atlantic Council website for that. Again, thank you all for tuning in, and we look forward to your participation in future Atlantic Council events. Thank you again, everybody. Thank you.